Welcome back, everyone. Let's start the chapter 2 of the Introduction to Interpreting, which is going to be the basic skills of interpretation. We will first learn what I call the 5 interpreting skills that will help you interpret accurately and completely. Next, we will cover 3 interpreters' tools, which I have briefly mentioned here and there in chapter 1. After this, you will feel so much more confident even on your very first call. Lastly, I will go over some technical stuff that you will want to know when you are interpreting. Before I talk anything about these 5 interpreting skills, I would like to start off with why we are learning the 5 interpreting skills and what they are for. We will use these 5 interpreting skills to interpret accurately and completely. I hope you now really have these 2 words engraved in your brain, accuracy and completeness. It is in our code of ethics, it's our responsibility as a conduit. These 5 skills that we are about to learn will help us interpret accurately and completely. Let me tell you what they are. First, listening, understanding, remembering, note-taking, and lastly, delivering. If you have been trained by me in the past, you might recognize this as 5 interpreting steps. When I was training interpreter candidates for a company several years ago, I used to call this 5 interpreting steps. But I decided to change the name to 5 interpreting skills, not steps, because many students intuitively thought that this would happen in this chronological order, which does look like that's what it is, but many of these skills that I'm about to explain will happen almost at the same time. So just keep that in mind, that it is not necessarily a step-by-step process. It is 5 different skills that we will need to use in harmony to interpret accurately and completely. Let's talk about the very first skill, listening. When we are interpreting, especially as an OPI, all of your sources will come from listening to the utterance. You might think there really isn't much to learn about listening, and it would be weird to call it a skill, but trust me, listening is actually not something that will happen naturally if you don't value the significance of this skill. To explain this, we need to know the difference between listening and hearing. When we listen to something, that process is considered active. We have a clear goal of obtaining information when we listen to something. On the other hand, when we just hear something, that's passive. We don't intend to hear something. It often just comes to us like a car honking on the road or a fire truck with a siren, passing by. We must understand this clear difference between the two and not get confused. We are listening to the utterance, not just hearing it. But this can be difficult because when you're interpreting, you hear all kinds of stuff. Maybe you live with a mom who is trying to vacuum while you're working. Maybe you have kids who cannot stop running around the house. Or maybe you have a baby that just cries like there's no tomorrow. Or maybe you might have a dog or a cat that just barks and meows whenever you sit down. When these noises around are being heard by the interpreter, it really takes away the interpreter's ability to interpret accurately and completely because we cannot obtain the information as best as we can. That is why interpreters must have a quiet environment, and that is a requirement. Say you want to work as a doctor. You would have to have a proper education and a degree in practicing medicine. If you want to become a police officer, you need to be physically fit and equipped with proper knowledge on how to operate firearms. Just like that, interpreters are required to have a quiet environment, free from these noises. Often your LSPs will make it very clear about these requirements, so make sure you are able to put yourself in a noise-free space. In fact, hearing a noise is not the only thing that interferes with our listening skill. Things like smell of food, or extreme temperature like heat or cold that affect our physical condition, or being upset and emotional that will make us not focused 100% at work. these can be all detrimental to our listening skills. That's why it is really important that we know how to provide ourselves with a quiet environment where we can be calm and cool. I know many people worry because they live in a place where some of these noises are just inevitable. Still, there are things you can do to mitigate the situation. If you know that this is the career you wish to pursue, I strongly suggest investing in proper equipment such as headphones and a microphone with a noise canceling function and a backdrop or lighting for a clean, solid background if you work as a VRI. Next skill is understanding. When I say understanding, you should first think about the 5 W's and 1 H. I hope you have learned or heard about what these are. That's what, when, where, why, who, how, right? I call these the key information. Understanding an utterance really means we are extracting this key information from the utterance. Now, this is about to get a little technical, but don't be scared. I will explain. When we interpret or translate between two languages, we want to understand which linguistic equivalents we need to provide. Namely, there are two different types: formal equivalents and functional equivalents. Maybe some of you started thinking, oh no, this started getting really difficult, I want to quit. But don't worry, let me try to explain it with an example. Here's me, and let me give you an example sentence. Mason is a good-looking Korean guy, and he lives in Canada. Well, I do live in Canada. Good-looking, maybe? Anyway, let's say that we are interpreting this into a different language, whatever language you speak. Once again, I'm going to use my magical square brackets and write my renditions in English. Here's my first rendition. Mason is a good-looking Korean guy, and he lives in Canada. It's exactly the same as how it was said in English, and I just want to clarify that this is supposed to be in another language, in my case, Korean. But if you are taking this course and you are capable of understanding what I have been telling you so far, I believe you are able to interpret this sentence into your language without a problem. Now, to interpret this sentence, I could also do it this way. Mason is a handsome Korean man who resides in Canada. I mean, that basically says the same thing, right? Now I have a question for you. Do you think one of these is a better interpretation than the other? Is A better? Or is B better? Or are they the same? What do you think? I will come back to this question later on, but let me finish what I was trying to explain first. Here, the rendition A is what we call a formal equivalence. This means we are interpreting word for word. From now on, I will just use this W4W notation, and that means it is a word for word or a formal equivalence. We also often call this a verbatim interpreting as well. The rendition B, we call it functional equivalence, and I will notate it with M4M, which stands for meaning, The key difference between the W4W and M4M is where our focus is. For formal equivalence, the W4W, the focus is on the source language. Our priority is to preserve the utterance as much as possible. So often when we interpret word for word, it might sound quite stiff or formal, or in some case, weird or awkward. Think about reading a medical intake form or an instruction manual for a medical device. It doesn't sound like how we would talk to other people, right? It will sound very formal. But for the functional equivalence, we focus on the target language. I am almost certain that you, as a bilingual person, had a moment when you were watching a movie or a TV show that's either in English or in your language, and there is a closed caption, like the subtitles, and sometimes you go, oh, why did they translate it that way? Oh, that's not correct. That's not what it means. I don't know, something like this. And of course, this could also happen due to a mistranslation, but often that weird translation is just a byproduct of M4M, the functional equivalence. Because the functional equivalence focuses more on the target language, it will usually sound more smooth, more localized, more fitting in the target language. Now we know what word for word or meaning for meaning means. Let's come back to our example and the question that I had asked. Is A a better interpretation than B? I personally don't think this is an easy question. To make this a bit easier, let's try to define what a better interpretation even means. We say A is a better interpretation than B if A is more accurate and complete than B. We have been talking about this accuracy and completeness a lot, right? Then, what does it mean to be accurate and complete? I know I am asking a lot of questions right now, but it will come all together. So let's stay focused. Here is the same sentence that I gave you earlier. Now I will have 3 renditions to interpret this sentence. Here is a rendition A. Mason is a good-looking Korean guy and he lives in Vancouver, Canada. Do you see anything that's off? Yes, of course. This rendition A added the city Vancouver, which was not in the original utterance, right? So we say there is an addition in this interpretation. How about this one? The rendition B is Mason is a good-looking guy who lives in Canada. What's wrong with this one? I hope that was easy to spot. The rendition B omitted that I am Korean. In the original utterance, it said good-looking Korean guy, but in the rendition, it omitted that. So we say there is an omission in this rendition B. How about another one? Mason is a good-looking Korean guy who lived in Canada. What's wrong with this one? The rendition C changed the grammar tense to a past tense when describing where Mason lives, so it altered the meaning of the utterance, right? So we say the rendition C has altered the meaning. So I would like you to remember this: addition, omission, and meaning alteration, because they are going to be the criteria for us to know if a rendition is accurate and complete. When your interpretation is accurate and complete, it means there is no misinterpretation. When we say there is no misinterpretation, that means your rendition is free of any additions, omissions, or meaning alterations. There are other things that interpreters will have to be careful of, such as summarizing, embellishment, and editorializing, but understanding and being able to identify these 3 things for now will sufficiently help you doing your job correctly. Wait, what is our job? Our job is being a ball. As a conduit, this is what we are going to always watch out for. We try to stay away from additions, omissions, and meaning alterations. Now going back to what I was asking earlier once again, so is A a better interpretation than B? Now we know that this is the same thing as asking, is A more accurate and complete than B? Which would be essentially, does B have more additions, omissions, or meaning alterations than A? That really is the question. Then what's your answer? My answer is no. When I hear the rendition A and B, they both carry exactly the same meaning. Therefore, when I evaluate these 2 renditions, I will say that B is just as good as A, and vice versa. It is really important that we understand the interpreting we do is M for M, the meaning for meaning interpretation, providing the functional equivalence. Of course, there are times when we do word for word. For example, interpreting for someone who is describing an event that is being recorded on a police report, or any situations that have a legal characteristics, especially when things are going on record, we generally want to focus on the utterance and provide most true to meaning type of interpretation. But for our typical daily calls, including the vast majority of the medical calls, we want to ensure that the rendition is understood clearly by the listener. Here is an example. Let's say the doctor said, "Hello, Mr. Mason, I'm giving you some pain medication for your headache." You can go ahead and try to interpret this in your language. How would you say it? I will give you some example. A. Hello, Mr. Mason, I'm giving you some pain medication for your headache. B. Hi, Mr. Mason, I'll give you some medicine for pain to help with your headache. And C. Hey, Mr. Mason, what I'm giving you now is the painkiller, and it is going to relieve your pain you have in your head. What is the point that I'm trying to make here? If you are still going, oh, the rendition B doesn't actually say pain medication. It says medicine for pain, and that's not the same. Or, oh, the rendition C says a painkiller, and it actually never said headache, so that's a misinterpretation, right? If that's what you're still thinking, I strongly suggest you to stop this video and go back and rewatch what I was explaining about the misinterpretation earlier. It is crucial that we understand that all of these three renditions, A, B, C, are functionally equivalent, meaning they carry the exactly same meaning. So I am saying, when you are interpreting from one language to another, your interpretation is generally acceptable if the meaning remains the same. And as I explained earlier, to keep the meaning intact, we have to make sure that we don't have any additions, omissions, and altering meaning. I really hope this is clear because I'm going to confuse you a little bit with the next example. Same situation. This time, this is what the doctor says to Mr. Mason. Don't worry, Mr. Mason. Taking this medicine will be a piece of cake. Here, what does this a piece of cake mean? Like, are we talking about literally a slice of cake that is your medicine? I mean, I would love to, but no, of course not, right? It just means that it is something really easy to do. It is saying it is not difficult at all to take this medicine. So when we are interpreting, we can say, don't worry, Mr. Mason, taking this medicine will be very easy. And that will definitely keep the meaning of the utterance. Now, what happens if you keep the exact words and say, don't worry, Mr. Mason, taking this medicine will be a slice of cake? Saying that idiom expression literally the same way in my language. Does this mean word for word? No, please don't get confused. This is a misinterpretation. Why? Because it altered the meaning. Saying something will be a piece of cake is an expression that exists in English, not in Korean. You will be surprised how many people say that they are doing a word-for-word interpretation when they are actually just misinterpreting. Once you really understand this idea, then we can start exploring to see how we can interpret things even better. One example, in my language, this expression, eating cold congee or porridge, means the same thing as a piece of cake. You know, it's not really difficult to eat something that's not too hot. I think that's the idea. So saying this in my language would be a perfect meaning for meaning interpretation. I also have another expression in my language saying eating rice cake while laying down. I hope you can also visualize this in your head. You know, I'm just chilling in my bed on my couch eating rice cake, which is like a common snack in Korea. So this would be another example of meaning for meaning interpretation. Of course, as a Korean person, I can only give examples in Korean, but that doesn't mean this only applies to me. Whatever the language you speak, it is very likely that you have some sort of idioms to say something like this. Even if you believe you don't for this specific example, it is highly likely that you have language-specific idiomatic expressions that will come up when we interpret. That is why it is so important for us to clearly understand the differences between the word for word, meaning for meaning, and misinterpretation. Being able to understand an utterance thoroughly is a key factor for providing an accurate rendition. I cannot stress this enough, especially if you are new to interpreting or if you do not have a sufficient level of language proficiency. And this is where so many people will get frustrated and worried. I know for a fact many people who are watching this video are not a native English speaker. And you might be wondering, is my English good enough to become an interpreter? Exactly the same question can be asked for the other language you speak if English is your first language. I do have my opinion about this, but I'm not going to talk about that here because that takes time, and we have many other important things to cover in this course. So I will give you a short answer to the question. If you can fully understand the utterance, most likely yes. I understand that was a very short and ambiguous answer, but I will just leave it at that. I am mentioning this because I firmly believe this understanding skill is actually the most important skill for new interpreters or people who don't feel confident about their language proficiency. If you are curious about what my take is on this topic, I will be making a separate video and post it on YouTube. To wrap this up, I just want to make sure that everyone understands how important this understanding is because this is once again what will make our rendition accurate. Once we can understand the utterance for accuracy, we can utilize the next two skills for a complete rendition. If that is all clear, let's move on to the next part. Here is the third interpreting skill. It is remembering. I used to call this a memory retention skill, but basically it is the skill of remembering the information we obtain using the skill number 1 and number 2. Our memory is going to be the primary source of interpretation. I will explain this further later on, but this is something that goes against our nature, meaning if you don't learn what I'm about to teach you, you will most likely not use your memory as a primary source of interpretation. Once again, we will come back to this. Here is a breakdown of what is going to happen when we utilize these first 3 skills. Remember, we listened to the utterance, not just hearing it, using our skill number 1. Then we understood the meaning of the utterance by extracting the key information. Remember the 5 W's and 1 H, right? We are going to recall that information and have it stored in our brain. This is going to be very different from memorizing every single word from the utterance. That is not what we are doing. Remember, we talked a lot about the M4M, meaning for meaning interpreting, and simply there is no reason for us to memorize every single thing that our clients or LEPs say. Why don't we try some practice? I will call this an interpreting skills practice, but specifically just for skills 1, 2, and 3. Using our first skill, we have to listen attentively and carefully. Once again, this is different from just hearing a sound, okay? Next, we're going to use our skill number 2 and try to understand what is happening. Try to visualize the image. Who is talking? Where are they? What are they talking about? Being able to extract this key information will really help us understand the gist of the utterance. Next, we are going to try our best to remember what we listened to and understood using our skill number 3. As I said, that's where we are going to stop. For this exercise, I specifically want you to not take notes and do not say anything out loud. So here, you don't need to write down anything. You don't need to say anything until you are done listening. Then I will ask you some questions. Are you ready? Here we go.
Mr. Mason, it looks like your diabetes got a lot worse than the last time I saw you. That's the reason why you keep feeling dizzy and having swollen feet. Let's get you admitted to the hospital right away and have some blood work done.
Okay, I hope that wasn't too long. I would like to ask some questions to you. Who was that? Who was talking just now? It was a lady, but can you guess her occupation? I would guess some sort of a medical professional, probably a doctor, right? Whom were they speaking to? The person's name was Mr. Mason. And it sounds like Mr. Mason is a patient. Where is this place? Most likely a hospital, right? They did talk about getting Mr. Mason admitted, so it could be like an ER, but it sounded like they have met each other before, so not entirely sure about that. Who knows? What's the issue Mr. Mason is having? Well, the doctor clearly said his diabetes got worse, so it must be that, right? I hope you were able to catch this. Do you remember what the symptoms Mr. Mason had? I mean, I totally understand if your memory is slowly fading away by this point, but the doctor did say that Mr. Mason kept feeling dizzy and having swollen feet. I hope you remembered that. And lastly, what's their plan now? The doctor is going to admit the patient, meaning Mr. Mason will be hospitalized and get some blood exam done. Yes, I hope this was not too difficult. How did you do? Was it easy peasy or was it really difficult? Maybe some of you didn't listen to me carefully and decided to take some notes. Maybe you followed my instructions exactly and got all of the questions correct or missed a couple pieces of information here and there. That's all okay. What I really wanted to get out of this exercise is for you to practice picturing the image and understanding the situation. Who was talking? When did this happen? Where are they? What are they talking about? Why was the doctor concerned? How are they going to treat this illness? Sometimes you might not get all the information needed to answer these questions, but surely all utterances will contain some information. And our job is to listen carefully, extract the key information, and remember them as best as we can. This is really what remembering is all about. Now, I want to reiterate one really important thing. This is going to be your primary source of interpretation. That means when you are interpreting, you are going to first rely on your memory. Like I said before, your natural instinct will be doing something different. This will make a lot more sense once I get to our next skill, what everybody has been so eager to learn, the note-taking. I will see you there. Welcome back, everyone. Finally, the skill that everyone has been wondering and the topic that I've been bringing up again and again in the past videos is the note-taking. Before we proceed any further, I would like to make a statement. And this statement must be followed by my explanation. You cannot just take the statement and go around saying, oh my god, Mason said this, that's crazy, blah, blah, blah. Just hear me out first. Here is the statement. Note-taking is not as important as you think it is. I know that is a bold statement in many ways, but I really think this, especially for new interpreters who are just starting out and practicing their interpreting skills. Note-taking is by nature our secondary source of interpretation. Remember what the primary source of interpretation was? Yes, the remembering skill, the memory. When we are interpreting, we use our memory first. Then we use our note-taking. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of this chapter, these are skills, not steps. I know at this very moment, it really looks like a step number 1, listening. Step number 2, understanding. So on, right? But really, even this remembering and note-taking will happen simultaneously. What I mean by primary and secondary is that what we are going to rely on, what we will depend on more. Let me explain. When we are taking notes as an interpreter, we all do it differently. Some interpreters will write things only in English. Some interpreters maybe write only in the other language, for me in Korean. Maybe some interpreters will decide to mix both languages or take turns between the source language and the target language. Maybe some interpreters are more comfortable writing in words. Maybe others might find drawing or using symbols is more effective. Some people strongly prefer typing over handwritten notes, and I have seen many people who prefer the other way around. Just like this. Really, all interpreters have their own ways of taking notes, all different. Here's an example. Let's say the utterance was Mason is a handsome Korean guy. I apologize for this narcissistic example, but I hope it sticks to you better. Anyway, I would like to think about taking notes for this utterance. More specifically, the word handsome. How would you write this down if you were taking notes? Should we write HNDSM, which is one of the most common tactics of note taking, which is omitting all the vowels? But what if I wrote HNSM only? What about HS? How about just H? Or what if I just drew a face and put a thumbs up or write good to take notes for this word handsome? Which one is the best? Which one is the worst? Which one is okay and not okay? The point that I'm trying to make here is that there is no one correct answer. There is no one correct way of taking notes. So it simply doesn't make any sense for anybody to stand in front of you and say, hey, you need to say HNDSM for handsome, and you need to use this arrow going this way. You say this, then you should put this symbol for Monday, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't work like that. I cannot show you a correct way of taking notes because there are many different ways of taking notes. So what should I do? Should I just end this video, right? Because there is nothing to teach? No. Although there is no one correct way of taking notes, there are many wrong ways to take notes. So that's what I'm going to tell you instead. Here are the 3 wrong ways of taking notes. First one is going to be writing down everything. Have you ever heard of a term stenographer? What is a stenographer? This is not a quiz, so you don't have to Google this right now or anything. A stenographer is basically a person you see, usually in a courtroom, that types out things that are being said in the room. You see this lady typing with a keyboard, right? They actually use a special type of keyboard that will let them type a lot faster than what we normally use for a computer. Many interpreters try to work like a stenographer. And that is a big no-no. We are interpreters, not stenographers. Please try to remind yourself this. Like I've been saying again and again, we will use our memory as our primary source. And we are using note-taking as our secondary source. Now, some of you might wonder, why can't I just primarily take notes? You might say, I can type really fast. Actually, another thing that I always heard from one of my trainees in the past was, hey Mason, my memory is really not good. I'm not good at remembering things. So why can't I just write it down? So basically, for people who are saying this, is questioning, why do we have to remember things? Why can't we just write them all? That really is the question, right? And here is my answer. My answer is, yes, you can. Of course you can. But if you are a machine. Let me give you a hypothetical example. Let's say you are an interpreter with a superpower, ultra speed quantum computer that just literally transcribes everything our client and LEP say. Let's just suppose. So if our client says, hello, Mr. Kim, what is your date of birth? Without us having to write down anything, the computer spits out the transcription of the utterance. And same goes for the LEP. When the LEP speaks, it just writes everything in Korean. And don't worry about the text, it just says, hi, my date of birth is blah, blah, blah. If we have something like this, I mean, we definitely don't have to take any notes. We actually don't even have to remember anything, right? So in that hypothetical situation, we actually don't have to spend any energy to use skill number 3, remembering, and skill number 4, note-taking. But obviously, that's not what happens in real life, right? So my answer for this question is actually really simple. We are not a machine. We are humans. We don't just write down everything like that supercomputer because it takes a lot of energy to do that. I'll try to visualize this for you. Let's say that's our energy level. We are using this energy battery whenever we are using our skills to interpret. We also have the scale that shows the completeness of our rendition. More specifically, how effective we are being when we interpret. And when we have those two skills that we have been talking about, remembering and note taking. Now, think about a situation where we are completely relying only on our memory. When do we ever do this? Remember the interpreting skills practice we did? There, I specifically asked you to put down your pen and pencil and not take any notes. When that happens, we are not using any of our energy on note taking. We can just focus on remembering the key information we obtained with skills number 1 and number 2. Of course, because we are not writing anything down, if we are getting a long utterance, we will struggle to keep it accurate and complete because we are only using our memory retention skills, so the completeness skill is going to be lower. What about the other way around? When we only take notes and not remember anything, yes, our completeness scale will go up because what we are doing is what a stenographer or that supercomputer was doing, right? But obviously, we are not a machine. So this takes a lot of energy. If you have to write down every single thing that our client and LEP say in a day, maybe you could last like 1 hour? 2 hours? Think about doing that 7, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. You will not last and burn out within a week or two. I can promise you that. So essentially, choosing how much we remember and how much we write down is a trade-off. We have to balance between remembering and note-taking to ensure maximum efficiency and effectiveness. That's what we're trying to do. Going back to the priorities between these two, what did I say the primary source was again? It was the remembering. The secondary source, note-taking. Why is that? Why do we prioritize remembering over note-taking? The answer is because we do meaning for meaning interpreting. You see, when we are doing meaning for meaning, M4M interpreting, we actually don't have to have the exact wordings of the utterance. We focus on the rendition, our target language, meaning we are going to focus on being efficient a bit more than being effective by prioritizing our memory retention. I know this can sound really complicated. Personally speaking, it took me a long time to actually understand this concept even after I started working as an interpreter. In real life, many interpreters just quit within several months of their employment because they get way too tired. They interpret for hours a day, for weeks, and they're burnt out. Of course, this wouldn't be the only reason why people quit, but one of the biggest issues is that they don't know how to efficiently preserve their energy when they are interpreting, and that is not sustainable. Understanding this, being able to allocate your energy appropriately will really help you make this job definitely more sustainable. Here are some simple examples again. What is this stenographer doing? The person is going for 100% effectiveness, right? The reason why they can do this is because they are trained for this and they have special equipment for them to preserve their energy. Again, we are interpreters, not stenographers. Stop trying to work like a stenographer. Think about this situation where a nurse is simply saying hello or how are you, or just asking a patient for their name. Do we really need to worry about writing this down? for a very simple utterance like this? No, I don't think so. Here we can completely let go of the note-taking and just make sure we understand what's happening and what's being asked. We are able to preserve our energy, therefore we are being efficient. And because we provide meaning for meaning interpreting, we are able to preserve the correct, accurate, and complete meaning from the utterance as well. Therefore, we are being effective as well. How about this situation? This doctor is talking to a patient, and the utterance is not simple anymore. They are throwing in difficult medical terms and specific instructions. Here, should we just rely on our memory? I don't think that's a good idea anymore because the utterance is getting more complex and we are jeopardizing our accuracy and completeness if we don't do something about it. We can make sure that our interpretation is accurate and complete by taking notes, even if that means our energy level is going down. This is where you can see a clear difference between a skillful professional interpreter and a new interpreter who just started their work without this knowledge. Finding the right balance between these two so that you are still preserving your energy while providing accurate and complete renditions. This is also where an ethical issue might arise. Some seasoned legacy interpreters will purposely choose to give up on the accuracy and decide to preserve their energy. We call this, in a simple term, being lazy. That's exactly what this is talking about. So that was the first wrong way of taking notes, writing down everything. Here's the second one, remembering numbers. As an interpreter, we deal with numbers all the time. Maybe the client is providing confirmation number, reference number, appointment date and time, medical record number, all sorts of numbers. For our LEP, maybe date of birth, address, phone number, account number, member ID number. There are so many things. So when it comes to numbers, we do things differently. Whatever I said earlier does not apply for numbers. When we need to interpret numbers, my suggestion is just write it down. That means you should not try to remember these numbers. Instead, just take notes, write it down. You might think some small or easy numbers will be easy enough to memorize and remember without having to write it down to save your energy. I agree, but things are different in real life. For example, if I tell you to remember this date of birth, January 24th, 1960, and ask you, what was the date of birth just 5 seconds later, I'm sure many of you will remember it without a problem. But in real life, this is not the only call we have. We do this for hours. And when we do this for hours, your brain does not do a very good job, no matter how sharp you are with numbers usually. As an interpreter, I cannot count how often this happens. And what I find fascinating is when I take notes, I write down the numbers. And as I'm about to interpret, I get confused. I look at my note, and it says 1/24/1960, but in my head, I think, oh wait, is that right? I thought this person just said 1950. Is it 1950? Or is it 1960? I do this in my brain. I can say this from my personal experience. 99 out of 100 times, my note is correct, not my memory. It's actually really weird, but I'm sure you will experience something similar as an interpreter. So when we are dealing with numbers, our brain can do some silly things. You are more than welcome to see it for yourself when you work as an interpreter, but trust me, just write it down. It will be a lot easier. The last wrong way of taking notes is only using words in your notes. As I mentioned, all interpreters take notes differently. You will need to find what fits you best. However, generally speaking, many remote interpreters will prefer typing, when many on-site interpreters will take handwritten notes. There are many factors to be considered for this, and I am not going to talk too much about this, but generally this is how interpreters will take their notes. Of course, this might have to be different in some cases. Typing and handwritten note-taking have the same principle, but are quite different. Once again, because there are no right answers for this, I am just going to show you some very basic techniques that can come in handy when you take notes. Here is a couple of note-taking techniques. First is using symbols. Using arrows, lines, shapes to visualize ideas in your notes is going to be really effective. Another technique is spacing and chunking. What I mean by spacing and chunking is to either separate the text or grouping things together to visualize the order of ideas or compartmentalize different ideas so you can come up with more organized renditions. I understand that can just sound all gibberish. So here's an example. Let's say this is what the client is saying and there are two different ways of taking notes. Although I'm not saying number 2 on the right is the answer, I do think using numbers and arrow and different rows and spaces to make your notes clear are going to be better than the number 1 where you are writing out everything in just one line. I hope you are able to see that. So let's summarize the 3 wrong ways of taking notes. First, writing down everything. Please don't do that. We're interpreters, not stenographers, right? Second, trying to remember numbers in our head. Trust me, it's just not a good idea. Just write it down. And lastly, taking notes only using words. Try to be creative. Try using symbols, lines, spacing, chunking, or whatever you think that's going to help you take better notes. But going back to my bold statement at the beginning, I really think this is not a core solution that will just magically fix all your problems. Here is the reason why I said this. Let's say you are practicing your interpretation and you keep making misinterpretations. I have seen so many new interpreters or trainees start blaming their note-taking skills right off the bat. People say, "Oh, I can't write fast enough. Oh, my note-taking is inconsistent. I need more practice." In fact, the way I see it is that if your rendition is not accurate or complete, the problem is most likely you're listening, understanding, and remembering, not your note-taking. That is why if you are someone who believes that your lack of note-taking skill is the root cause of all your problems, you should actually understand that note-taking is not as important as you think it is. Still, note-taking is definitely a very important part of our interpreting skills, and as you improve, the power of note-taking will be more and more important. If this is clear, let's move on to our final skill. Here is the final skill. It is delivery. When we say delivery, we are talking about actually speaking out and providing your rendition to our client or LEP. Here's a list of things we should think about when we deliver our interpretation. Timely rendition, rate of the speech or simply the speed of your speech, pace or the rhythm of your speech. If you are a VRI or an on-site interpreter, you must account for your body language as well. A bit controversial topic, but we will talk about pronunciation as well. And lastly, but most importantly, the tone of your voice. I know there are many things in the list, but don't worry, let's go over one by one. First thing to talk about for delivering is going to be a timely rendition. What does this mean? As an interpreter, you are expected to start your interpretation within a reasonable time. Let's say this is what the doctor said. "Hello, Mr. Kim, when did the nausea and vertigo start?" And the interpreter is not sure about the word vertigo, so we're panicking. The doctor finished giving us the utterance, but the interpreter is not starting with the rendition because we're not ready. Most likely after about 4 or 5 seconds or so, your client and the LEP will start saying something like, "Hello, interpreter, are you still there?" Something like this. We want to provide a timely rendition, and when I say timely, probably we want to start within 3 to 5 seconds once the utterance is complete. And I understand, as an interpreter, this 3 to 5 seconds will not be very long. Remember all the things that we have to do? We have to listen carefully. We have to understand what they're saying. We have to remember what they're saying. We have to take notes. If there's a term that we don't know, we might have to look up this word, and doing all of this in 3 to 4 seconds, it can feel really challenging, especially when we are just starting out. But there is a specific reason why I say we want to provide this rendition in about 3 to 5 seconds. The real reason why we want to provide this is because there. How did that feel? How long did that pause feel like to you as a listener? When you are expecting somebody to say something to you, the time you perceive can be different. Once again, as an interpreter, we are busy. We are busy doing so many things so that 3, 4, 5 seconds will often not feel very long, but that is not the case for our clients and LEPs. They are literally standing there waiting for the interpreter to speak. And if the interpreter takes anything longer than 4 to 5 seconds, which is a very common delivery time for many interpreters, they will start feeling worried. They will start thinking maybe the interpreter got disconnected. Maybe they will start thinking the interpreter doesn't know how to interpret things. Maybe they will start questioning the interpreter's ability to interpret accurately and completely. All of this because of taking a couple extra seconds. I understand that sounds really scary, but as long as you understand that the time will feel differently for our clients and the LEPs compared to what it feels like for us, the interpreters, usually you are going to be fine. I know many people will still worry a lot about not being able to provide a timely rendition, and really the solution to that isn't going to be a quick fix. It takes time to build that confidence and find your own rhythm. But one quick fix that you can definitely start utilizing is what we call the interpreter's tools, which will be covered in the next chapter. So for now, try not to worry too much about this. Just be aware that we want to provide a timely rendition because it will relatively feel longer for our clients and LEPs. Next is going to be the rate of your speech, or the speed of the speech, meaning how fast you talk when you interpret. So we say speaking about 120 to 150 words per minute could be considered average speed for a normal conversation. So ideally, we want the speed of our speech to be around this number so our listeners can hear us clearly. But realistically speaking, I don't think any interpreters have to sit down and measure how fast they speak, coming up with the target words per minute. No, I really don't think so. Instead, I just want you to make sure that you are not speaking too slow so that you sound something like this. Or too fast that you are talking like this and no one is understanding you properly because you just don't stop talking and you're talking way too much at a speed that is just way too fast. I would like to just say that this would be much more of a common sense. When we talk to our friends, when we speak to somebody on the phone, or when you go see a doctor, how fast do you speak? Or how fast do other people speak? Just try to keep that in mind, and if we ever get feedback from our clients or LEPs that we are speaking too fast or too slow, make sure you adapt it and be aware that you might have an issue with this rate or speed of your delivery. Just like many other issues that interpreters will have on delivering, being aware of the issue often fixes itself, and being worried about it often makes it worse. So don't worry about this too much. Just be aware of the issue if you have one. Next is pace, or the rhythm of your speech. Specifically, I want you to talk about when your pace is inconsistent or choppy. To explain this, I'm going to use my music skills and turn this into a music lesson. Let's say this is the ideal rhythm that you want to have when you are interpreting. Da da da, da da da, da 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 da. That's a nice rhythm, right? But now, this is what many interpreters will do instead. Da da da, da da da, da 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 da. What's happening? This inconsistent rhythm, whether you are abruptly slowing down or rushing at the end, happens very frequently to many interpreters. We will talk more about the solutions to these problems later on, but for now, I just want you to know that this is something we can and we will work on to improve our delivery. To do that, we essentially just have to find our own rhythm. When you have no idea what this ideal rhythm is supposed to be, just try to listen to other people around you. Maybe something like, "Hi there, how can I help you today?" Or maybe something like, "Hello doctor, I've been taking Tylenol for my headache for 3 days now, but it's not going away for some reason." Sometimes we forget that interpreting is also just a talking. It's a part of conversation, right? It's a person talking to another person. But because we have so many things to do in our head, we often forget that this should be a person talking. We end up sounding something like, "Hello, doctor. I have been taking Tylenol for my headaches for 3 days now, but it's not going away for some reason." Once again, what we want to do is to find our own rhythm and just be aware of our problems if there is one. Next is body language. Of course, this only applies if you are working as a video remote interpreter or interpreting on site. Your body language includes your facial expressions, hand gestures, or your posture that you show during the session. You might think this is a bit of overkill, but even something as simply as nodding or shaking your head can be really effective in some cases. For example, this is a really common communication error that happens to many Korean people. When someone asks, "You didn't do something, did you?" Many Korean people will say yes when they actually meant to say no. I know for a fact that many other languages or even English speaking people get this wrong sometimes. So when this doctor asks, "You didn't eat anything, did you?" Although this patient meant to say, "No, I did not eat anything," the patient might just say, "Yeah," as in agreeing with what the doctor was stating. Usually this isn't a problem because of the context and the clients just understand what they mean, but sometimes it can get confusing, and still it is our job as an interpreter to make sure that there is no misunderstanding. So we can correctly interpret this saying, "No, I didn't," but also add that body language factor by simply shaking our head to make it crystal clear that the patient did not eat or drink anything before the surgery. I am not saying this is what you have to do, but I am saying when our body language is used correctly, our delivery will be able to provide an extra layer of assurance to our clients and LEPs. One thing I do have to warn you is that we have to be culturally appropriate too. I personally cannot think of any examples other than really obvious ones like sticking up your middle finger or rolling your eyes. But maybe in your culture specifically, there might be something that you do not want to do because it can offend the LEP. For instance, I would definitely not cross my legs looking all snobby or sticking up my pinky in my ear when someone is talking. So I think it is definitely a good idea to be considerate and knowledgeable about some of the culture-specific body languages if there is one. The next factor for delivering is going to be your pronunciation. Before I start, I want to make something clear. Please don't mistake mispronunciation for an accent. An accent is just one particular way of speaking a language. It is okay to have an accent as long as our accent does not create a misunderstanding or a miscommunication. A mispronunciation is simply saying a word incorrectly. Many people mix up these two terms, and this becomes a problem when people incorrectly enunciate a word and just blame it on their accent. Many multilingual people who speak English as a second language, including myself, may not speak with an American or British English accent. And there's nothing wrong with that. Having an accent is perfectly normal and natural, especially if English is your second language. I was born and raised in South Korea until the age of 14. Then I moved to Canada where I had to learn English. Because of this, I am able to speak with what people call a standard American English accent, but my Korean accent is definitely still there when I say certain things, and I still mispronounce words all the time because I learned English as my second language. I have one example for you. When I first came to Canada, I remember saying mayonnaise to my friend. Did you understand what I just said? Mayonnaise? The word that I said was mayonnaise. Just said it in a very Korean way of saying it. I remember my friends were laughing when they found out what I was trying to say. I know they meant no harm. But to me, this was quite embarrassing and frustrating because there were so many words like that, which other people couldn't understand what I meant because of my mispronunciation. Here is another example. When I was working as an interpreter, I had this call. It was an auto insurance call. I was interpreting for the auto insurance company, claims adjuster, and an LEP who was involved in a car accident that was a hit and run. When the client asked the LEP if he saw the other vehicle, the LEP says something like, "Oh, I'm not sure. I think it was a white color sedan." This word sedan, which is just a type of car. In Korean, we do use the same term for it, but we say sedan. So when I was interpreting, I just totally forgot how I would say this word sedan in English. So this word came out of my mouth the way I would say it in Korean, and I said, I can't remember. I think it was a white sedan. Then the client didn't understand what I had said and asked me to repeat. I mean, I was already panicking as I was saying it because I knew I didn't say the word correctly. So I muted my microphone. I quickly looked up the word sedan and listened to the pronunciation to find out how it is said in English, and I quickly corrected myself. It was embarrassing. I felt dumb. I think if you are a person who learned English as a second language, maybe you understand what it felt like. Or if you were born in a country that speaks English, maybe you experienced something similar with the other language you speak. When this kind of pronunciation mistakes happen, it is so easy for us to get defensive. And I understand. When we speak in English, there are some people out there who belittle us, make us feel like we are not good enough because we don't speak their language the way they do, completely disregarding the fact that we speak another language on top of English. People like that exist before, still exist today, and will continue to exist in the future. So, should this 14-year-old Mason just be sad that his friends were making fun of him for saying mayonnaise instead of mayonnaise? I mean, all he did was saying a silly word like mayonnaise a little differently. He was still learning the language, and that is really how we learn the language. Trial and errors, right? There is really nothing bad that could happen from these errors. However, as an interpreter, it is a different story. When you are a professional interpreter who is expected to be fluent in both languages, then it is our responsibilities that our clients and LEPs can understand us clearly. I am not saying that you cannot make any pronunciation mistakes. That is just not possible. Of course, we are not perfect. Of course, mistakes can happen. It happens to me all the time. But what I want you to understand is that it is the attitude that we should have. This isn't something beyond our ability. I want people to stop thinking like there's nothing we can do about it. Mispronunciation is something we are able to fix and something we should fix if it happens. It takes effort, just like all other interpreting skills we have been talking about. Let me give an example. I know some people have hard time saying these two numbers, 15 and 50, differently. So sometimes when we try to say 15, other hears 50, and vice versa. And as you can see, this can be a huge misinterpretation. So if you know that you often have hard time saying these two numbers correctly, I want you to acknowledge that and make sure our clients are able to understand us correctly. Maybe you could practice how to say it. Maybe you could confirm it by saying 1 5 and 5 0 instead. If you just say, oh, this is how I've been saying it my whole life, if others can't understand me, that's their problem, not mine. I personally think you are not taking the responsibilities that interpreters should. Here's another example. Another type of work that I do a lot besides interpreting is call monitoring. I work for different LSPs as a quality assurance specialist and listen to other interpreters' calls to monitor if they are meeting the company's standard. One day, I was monitoring one Korean interpreter's call, which was a medical call. The patient said that he was taking medication for hyperthyroidism, which is basically a condition of your thyroid creating too much thyroid hormone. Of course, the LEP said this in Korean, and I guess the interpreter was not familiar with this word in Korean. The interpreter stayed silent for a while. It was clear that the interpreter was busy looking up the term. When the interpreter finally found out the term hyperthyroidism in English, the interpreter started reading it out loud and said this: I am taking medicine for hypothyroidism. Here, the problem is because the interpreter was not familiar with the proper pronunciation of the term, the interpreter failed to say hyper correctly and said what sounded like hypo, which means exactly the opposite of hyper. This did not become a huge issue because really the doctors and nurses are often careful enough to double check with the medicine and sort of figure it out on their own. Or for this kind of common mispronunciation issue, they would usually double check with the interpreter, asking questions like, "Hey interpreter, did you say hypo or hyper?" if they were ever confused. But having a moment like this means that we are relying on our clients to be accurate. We are not proactively doing everything we can to ensure accuracy of our interpretation. So what is the problem here? Is it the interpreter not knowing the medical term, like hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism? Is that the issue? Or is it that they didn't enunciate the word correctly? So is it the mispronunciation that's the issue? No, I am not going to blame the interpreter not knowing this specific medical term or not being able to say it correctly, because this could have happened to anybody. Just like how I didn't say the word sedan correctly in a call. Then again, what's the problem? The problem is the interpreter, knowing that this is a term that was confusing, they were not sure as they were saying it and pretended like nothing wrong happened from the interpreter's end. The ideal situation would have been as soon as the interpreter found out that there is a chance of misunderstanding because of the interpreter's delivery problem, they should have apologized, come in and explained further so there is no misunderstanding. This is what I want to make it clear. When I talk about pronunciation or honestly any other delivering skills in this lesson, I am not saying that you have to be a perfect interpreter who never makes this mistake. I still make mistakes all the time. What I want to tell you as an instructor and a fellow interpreter is that we should not just treat this issue as if it is somebody else's problem. This is our problem. And as long as we try our best to fix it, we can continue to improve. I hope this is clear. Here is the final bit of delivering skills. It is the tone of voice. Let me throw in another statement that you should not forget. We interpreters deliver the tone, but we do not mimic. What does this mean? Let's say the doctor is giving some bad news to the patient and their family, saying, "Sir, your father's condition is getting worse." Imagine if I interpret this like this: "Sir, your father's condition is getting worse. Oh no." I really hope you are able to understand what is going wrong here. What if it's good news? Our client is saying, congratulations, your mortgage application has been approved. You can buy a house now. And we say, congratulations, your request has been approved. Yay. This doesn't sound right. This can be so confusing for the listeners, right? This is what I meant by delivering the tone of voice, but we will not mimic. For example, the LEP is crying on the phone saying, I'm sorry, doctor, we can't afford the surgery. And it's just a terrible, terrible place for the LEP to be. Here, we are not going to start crying together with the LEP. For the same reason, we are not going to mimic and yell because our LEP is yelling. We're not going to sigh out loud because our client is doing that. We don't mimic the speaker, but we try our best to deliver the original tone of the speaker's voice. If you are still confused what I exactly mean by delivering the tone of voice, I completely understand. I don't think it is you. It's just explaining this with words. It's quite tricky for me. But honestly speaking, a lot of this will come to many of you with a common sense. If we are interpreting for an LEP who is frustrated with the client service, we want to sound serious instead of sounding happy and cheery. If we are interpreting for a client who is an OBGYN doctor telling a mother who just had a healthy baby, we don't want to sound like something bad happened. Really, that is all. But what I'm more concerned about and what I want you to be aware of is speaking in a monotone. After hours of work, you will get tired. You will get tired of this annoying LEP who keeps yelling on the phone and this obnoxious client who is so rude to everyone. After a series of these phone calls, it will be really difficult to wear a smile on your face and start to not care about people, your work, or anything just anymore. And this really shows. When the interpreter speaks in a completely flat monotone, sir, your father's condition is getting worse. Congratulations, your request has been approved. I'm sorry, doctor, we can't afford the surgery. Is there anything else we can do? Really, so many interpreters sound just like this. And it just kills me when I listen to people's calls. And don't get me wrong, I have been there myself. I have taken 2.5 hour long call, interpret for an internet company customer service rep, trying to explain how to fix a modem and a Wi-Fi router. I'm sure I didn't interpret with enthusiasm the whole time. But what I want us to remember is that we are providing a service called interpretation. We want our customers to be satisfied with our service. And to satisfy our customers, delivering the tone of voice properly will really help them to get the best interpreting experience. That concludes the delivering skill. As you start practicing interpreting later on, you will start having some issues with these. When you do, come back to this video and remind yourself what you need to consider when you deliver your rendition. I hope this was clear. Now that we have covered all 5 interpreting skills, I just want to give you a quick reminder before we move on to the next part of the lesson, 3 interpreters tools. These 5 interpreting skills are used because we want to interpret accurately and completely. All of these skills are something that you will be working on forever, as long as you work as an interpreter. And the delivering skill is one of the reasons why I think there is no perfection in interpreting. But sometimes when I'm interpreting, I feel like I'm really good. It feels like everything is perfect, and I am sure you will get this feeling sooner or later once you start working as an interpreter. Sometimes I can listen really well. I understand the correct meaning. I obtain all the right information and have it remembered. I take just enough notes to remind me what I need to remember. Then my delivery is perfect. Right on time, right on point. I don't stutter. I don't hesitate. My pronunciation is good. It's elegant. It's eloquent. It just feels right. Sometimes I do feel like that, and I'm proud of myself. But also sometimes I can't listen very well. Sometimes I can't understand what my client is saying. Sometimes I can't remember what my LEP said. I wrote down what I heard, but I can't even understand what I wrote down. Sometimes I have a terrible delivery. I stutter, I stumble, I completely screw things up, and I just feel like I am not good enough for this job. This happens. It will happen all the time. But once again, this isn't something that we build, and then go, okay, we're done. I told you that we have to be like a professional athlete, right? We don't just stop learning because we know everything in our head. We don't just stop practicing because we did one perfect interpretation. This goes on and on as long as we work as an interpreter. The very last concept that I want to quickly go over is what we already talked about in the very first lesson. Remember, we briefly talked about the modes of interpreting, right? Now, since we learned the 5 interpreting skills, we can see how this is used differently in consecutive interpreting and simultaneous interpreting. You see, when we are doing a consecutive interpreting, we listen to the utterance first and we provide a rendition. When we listen, we are actually also trying to understand what we are listening. We're also remembering what we are understanding. We also take notes as we try to see what we can and can't remember. As the listening part is done, we move on to the delivering part. This is where many new interpreters misunderstand these skills. Many interpreters think that our skills 2, 3, 4 stop as soon as we start delivering. But as you can see, that's not true. The only thing that we turn off is the skill number 1, listening, because the utterance is over. It is a common practice that we still use our brain power to understand, remember, and take notes as we deliver our rendition. Of course, if the utterance was short and simple, we might be done with understanding, remembering, and note-taking before we start speaking. But we don't always get to do that. And all of these things will happen simultaneously in our brain as we provide our rendition. What about simultaneous interpreting then? We are utilizing skills 1 to 5 at all times. It's really simple, but also you now see how complex it can be, right? I'm not going over this for you to worry about this right now. I'm going over this so you have a better, clearer concept in your head to see what we are doing in our head to interpret consecutively or simultaneously. I hope this helped.